November 11, 1942. A makeshift radar station on the coast of Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Sergeant Daniel Kowalski pressed his face closer to the glowing screen, his eyes burning from hours of staring at the phosphorescent sweep. The radar set was barely functional, a jury-rigged SCR-270 that had been salvaged from a damaged transport ship and assembled from parts that should never have worked together. The other operators had given up on it hours ago, dismissing it as useless junk that produced nothing but static and false returns. But Daniel had made a modification, a stupid modification, according to everyone who had seen it. He had taken an empty soup can from the mess tent, cut it in half and shaped it into a crude parabolic reflector that he mounted behind the radar's receiving antenna. The other men had laughed so hard that one of them had nearly choked on his coffee. A soup can, to improve military radar. The idea was absurd. But now, at 0347 hours, Daniel was seeing something on that modified screen that made his blood run cold. 43 distinct returns, approaching from the northwest at approximately 180 miles per hour. Aircraft, lots of aircraft, coming directly toward Henderson Field, the only American airstrip on the island. Daniel checked the range, 137 miles out. At their current speed, the Japanese planes would arrive in approximately 45 minutes. That was 45 minutes to wake the pilots, scramble the fighters, and get them into the air. 45 minutes that only existed because a sergeant with a soup can had extended the radar's range by nearly 60%. He grabbed the field telephone and cranked the handle, his hands shaking. The officer who answered was irritated at being woken. When Daniel reported 43 incoming aircraft detected by his modified radar, the officer's irritation turned to anger. "Your soup can radar? The thing everyone's been laughing about? Kowalski, if this is some kind of joke..." "Sir, it's not a joke, I'm looking at them right now. 43 aircraft, bearing 315, range 137 miles and closing. If we don't scramble everything we have in the next 10 minutes, Henderson Field is going to be a crater by sunrise." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then the officer said 5 words that would save hundreds of American lives. "Sound the general alarm." If you are watching from anywhere in the world, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We bring you stories from World War II that reveal the moments when ordinary soldiers changed history, when one person's unconventional thinking made the difference between life and death. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. These stories survive because we remember them together. Daniel Kowalski was born in 1919 in the industrial city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the son of Polish immigrants who had come to America seeking a better life and found instead the grinding poverty of the steel mills. His father, Stefan, worked 12-hour shifts in the furnaces of the great mills that lined the Monongahela River, coming home each night covered in soot and burns, too exhausted to do anything but eat and sleep before returning to do it all again. The Kowalski family lived in a narrow row house in the Polish Hill neighborhood, surrounded by other immigrant families who had fled the old country for the same promises of opportunity. The streets were crowded and dirty, the air thick with smoke from the mills, the sounds of a dozen languages mixing in the cramped alleyways. It was not the America that Stefan had dreamed of, but it was America nonetheless, a place where a man could work and save and hope that his children might have something better. But Daniel's father had one passion that the mills could not crush: radio. In the evenings and on Sundays, when the furnaces gave him a few hours of rest, Stefan Kowalski retreated to the small shed behind their row house and tinkered with radio equipment. He had built his first receiver in Poland as a young man, staying up late into the night to experiment while his parents slept, fascinated by the magic of pulling voices and music from the empty air. In America, he continued the hobby with whatever parts he could scavenge or afford: old vacuum tubes from broken receivers, wire salvaged from construction sites, surplus components from radio repair shops that had gone out of business during the Depression. The shed became a sanctuary, a place where Stefan could forget the mills and remember that he was more than just a pair of hands feeding the furnaces. Daniel grew up in that shed, watching his father coax signals from silence with patience that seemed almost infinite. By the time he was 8, he could identify components by sight: resistors and capacitors, tubes and transformers. By 10, He could solder connections without supervision, his small hands steady and precise. By 12, he had built his own crystal radio from scratch, pulling in stations from as far away as Chicago on a good night when the atmospheric conditions were right. His father taught him more than just the technical skills of radio construction. Stefan believed that radio was fundamentally about listening, about patience and attention, and the willingness to search for signals hidden in the noise that most people assumed was meaningless. Most people gave up too quickly, Stefan said. They heard static and assumed there was nothing there, nothing worth finding, but signals were always present, always waiting to be found by someone willing to look. The skill was in knowing how to look, how to tune not just the equipment but yourself, how to hear what others dismissed. The most important lesson came when Daniel was 14. His father had been trying for months to receive a particular shortwave station from Europe, but the signal was too weak to resolve clearly. Every night, Stefan would tune to the frequency and hear nothing but hissing and crackling, the ghost of a transmission that remained tantalizingly out of reach. Then Stefan built a reflector. It was a simple thing, a curved piece of sheet metal positioned behind the antenna to focus incoming signals the way a mirror focuses light. The principle was basic physics, something any engineer would have understood. But Stefan was not an engineer. He was a steelworker who thought about problems differently, who saw connections that educated men overlooked. The reflector worked. The station came through clearly for the first time, and Daniel listened with his father as a voice speaking Polish described events happening thousands of miles away. It was like magic, like reaching across the world and touching something that should have been impossible to touch. Daniel never forgot that night. He never forgot how a piece of scrap metal had transformed useless noise into crystal-clear signal. And he never forgot his father's words. "The signal is always there, son. You just have to help it find its way to you." When war came in December 1941, Daniel was 22 years old, working as a radio technician for a small station in Pittsburgh. He had spent the years since high school learning his craft, moving from amateur tinkering to professional work, building a reputation as someone who could diagnose problems that baffled more educated engineers. He was not wealthy, not successful by conventional measures, but he was good at what he did and he knew it. He enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, standing in a line that stretched around the block, waiting for hours in the December cold to sign the papers that would send him to a war he barely understood. The men around him spoke of revenge, of patriotism, of duty. Daniel thought about something simpler. He had skills that might be useful, and useful skills should be used. His technical skills were immediately recognized by the Army's classification system. Instead of being assigned to infantry and handed a rifle, Daniel was sent to the Signal Corps for training in military communications and radar technology. Radar was still a relatively new technology in 1941, a closely guarded secret that most Americans had never heard of, a word that did not even appear in newspapers. The British had used it to win the Battle of Britain, detecting incoming German aircraft in time to scramble fighters. Now America was racing to develop its own radar capabilities for a war that would be fought across 2 oceans. The principles were simple enough: broadcast radio waves into the sky and measure the reflections that bounced back from aircraft or ships. But the equipment was finicky, temperamental, prone to breakdowns and false readings. Operating it effectively required a combination of technical knowledge and intuitive understanding that few possessed. Daniel possessed it in abundance. His years in his father's shed had given him an instinct for radio signals that no amount of classroom training could match. He could hear things in the static that other operators dismissed as noise. He could tune equipment to peak performance with adjustments so subtle they were almost invisible. He could diagnose problems that baffled the official technicians. His instructors recognized his abilities, but were uncertain what to do with them. Daniel was not officer material. He lacked the education and the social polish that the Army valued in its leaders, but he was too valuable to waste as an ordinary radar operator, staring at screens in some backwater posting, while less skilled men handled more important work. The solution was a compromise that satisfied no one. Daniel was promoted to sergeant and assigned as a radar maintenance technician, responsible for keeping equipment operational, but not for the tactical decisions about how to use it. He would fix the machines, but not interpret their outputs. He would serve the technology but not command it. Daniel accepted the assignment without complaint. He had learned from his father that the best work was often done by people who received no credit for it. What mattered was not recognition, but results. In June 1942, he was shipped to the Pacific Theater and assigned to the 1st Marine Division, which was preparing for an operation that would become one of the most brutal campaigns of the war, the invasion of Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal was hell with palm trees. The Marines had landed in August 1942, seizing a Japanese airfield that was still under construction on a jungle-covered island that most Americans could not have found on a map. They renamed it Henderson Field after a Marine pilot killed at Midway, and immediately became targets for relentless Japanese counterattacks by land, sea, and air. For months, the Americans clung to a narrow perimeter around the airfield, while Japanese forces probed for weaknesses from the jungle, and Japanese aircraft bombed them with terrifying regularity. The island itself seemed determined to kill them. Malaria felled more men than enemy bullets. The heat was suffocating, the humidity unbearable. Tropical rains turned the ground to mud that sucked at boots and buried equipment. Insects swarmed in clouds thick enough to choke a man. And always, the Japanese were out there, in the jungle, on the sea, in the sky, waiting for the moment when American defenses would falter. Daniel arrived on the island in September, part of a reinforcement convoy that had survived Japanese submarine attacks to reach the embattled garrison. His assignment was to maintain the radar equipment that was supposed to provide early warning of incoming air raids, equipment that was, in his professional opinion, barely functional. The problems were multiple and severe, a cascading series of failures that would have been comic if the consequences were not so deadly. The main radar set had been damaged during transport and repaired with whatever parts were available, some of them salvaged from completely different equipment. The generators that powered it were unreliable, prone to failing at exactly the moments when they were most needed. The operators were undertrained, overwhelmed by the demands of constant combat, and exhausted beyond the point where careful attention was possible. The tropical environment was particularly brutal on electronic equipment. Humidity corroded connections. Heat warped components. Salt air ate at anything metal. Equipment that worked perfectly in the factories of America fell apart within weeks on Guadalcanal. Most critically, the radar's range was inadequate. The SCR-270 was designed to detect aircraft at distances of over 150 miles under ideal conditions. On Guadalcanal, with damaged equipment and constant interference from the island's volcanic terrain, the effective range was barely 80 miles. That gave the defenders perhaps 20 minutes of warning before a Japanese air raid arrived, enough time to sound the alarm and get men into shelters, but not enough time to get fighters into the air and positioned for interception. The result was a pattern of attacks that followed a grim routine. The radar would detect incoming aircraft. The alarm would sound. Men would dive for foxholes and slit trenches. Japanese bombers would arrive and drop their loads on Henderson Field. American fighters would scramble too late, arriving only in time to chase the departing attackers without achieving meaningful interceptions. Men died because of this pattern. Pilots died because they could not get airborne in time. Ground crew died because they could not reach shelter fast enough. Aircraft died on the ground, destroyed before they could even fight. Daniel watched this pattern repeat itself for weeks, growing more frustrated with each raid. The radar should have been able to do better. The physics allowed for detection at much greater ranges. The limitation was not fundamental, it was technical. A problem of equipment and optimization that should have been solvable. He started thinking about his father's reflector. The idea came to Daniel during a raid in late October, as he huddled in a foxhole while Japanese bombs shook the earth around him and the sky lit up with explosions. He had been thinking about the problem for weeks, turning it over in his mind during the long hours of equipment maintenance, during the sleepless nights when Japanese ships shelled the perimeter, during the moments of terror when the bombers came and there was nothing to do but wait and hope. The radar's problem was signal strength. The antenna was receiving reflections from distant aircraft, but those reflections were too weak to distinguish clearly from the background noise that filled the electromagnetic spectrum. If he could amplify the incoming signal, focus it somehow, concentrate it the way his father had concentrated shortwave broadcasts, the effective range might increase substantially. A parabolic reflector would do it. A curved surface positioned behind the receiving antenna would gather signals from a wider area and focus them on the receiver, effectively increasing the antenna's sensitivity. The principle was the same one his father had used decades ago in Pittsburgh, but building a proper parabolic reflector would require materials and tools that Daniel did not have: machine shops, precision instruments, carefully calculated curves. None of these existed on Guadalcanal, where survival itself was a daily achievement. What he did have was garbage. The Marines consumed enormous quantities of canned food, and the empty cans accumulated in piles around the camp. Soup cans, in particular, had a shape that was close to parabolic, not perfect, but perhaps close enough to make a difference. Daniel collected several cans, cut them open, and experimented with different configurations. He calculated focal lengths based on the can's curves, adjusted positions, tested and retested. The other men watched him with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Poor Kowalski had finally cracked, they said. The stress of combat had driven him crazy, and now he was playing with garbage instead of doing his job. The mockery was constant and creative, a running joke that spread through the camp like a disease. They called his project the Soup Can Special and the Pittsburgh Radar Enhancement System. They asked if he was trying to tune in Tokyo Rose for better reception, if he was building a bomb shelter for mice, if he had finally lost what little remained of his mind. They suggested that maybe he should use beer cans instead. At least then the experiment would have some practical value, and they could drink the contents first. Daniel ignored them. He had learned from his father that innovation often looked like madness to people who could not see what the innovator was seeing. The laughter did not matter. Only results mattered. After 2 weeks of experimentation, he had a configuration that seemed to work. A half-can reflector, positioned precisely behind the receiving antenna, angled to focus signals from the northwest, the direction from which most Japanese raids approached. The modification looked ridiculous. It looked like something a child would build from scraps. It looked like the desperate improvisation of a man who had lost his grip on reality. But when Daniel tested it, the radar's effective range jumped from 80 miles to nearly 140 miles. Aircraft that had been invisible in the noise suddenly appeared as clear returns on the screen. The soup can had done what sophisticated engineering had failed to do. Daniel reported his results to his commanding officer, Lieutenant Harold Simmons. Simmons was skeptical. He had heard about the soup can modification and assumed it was either a joke or evidence of mental breakdown. But Daniel was insistent, and the numbers he presented were compelling enough that Simmons agreed to a trial period. The modified radar would be allowed to operate alongside the standard equipment. If Daniel's soup can actually improve detection ranges, the modification would be adopted. If not, Daniel would stop wasting everyone's time and go back to his regular maintenance duties. Daniel accepted the terms. He knew what his modification could do. Now he just needed the Japanese to prove it. The proof came on the night of November 11th, 1942, a date that would remain burned in Daniel's memory for the rest of his life. Daniel was alone at the radar station, having volunteered for the overnight shift that no one else wanted. The night watch was considered punishment duty, hours of staring at a screen that rarely showed anything, fighting exhaustion while the jungle sounds pressed in from all sides. But Daniel preferred it. The quiet hours gave him time to observe, to learn the radar's rhythms, to distinguish meaningful signals from the endless noise. The modified antenna pointed northwest toward the Japanese bases in the Upper Solomons, the soup can reflector gleaming dully in the starlight, looking exactly as absurd as everyone said it did. Daniel had positioned it based on calculations he had made in a notebook, now stained with sweat and mud, calculations that translated his father's lessons into the specific geometry of radar detection. The screen showed nothing for hours. Daniel watched the phosphorescent sweep rotate endlessly, painting the same empty picture over and over. The jungle sounds surrounded him, insects and birds and the distant crash of waves. Somewhere out there the war continued, but in this moment there was only the green glow of the radar and the patient work of watching. At 0347 hours, The screen changed. The returns appeared suddenly, a cluster of blips at the edge of detection range. Daniel leaned forward, counting quickly. 43 distinct contacts, moving in formation, heading southeast. The bearing put them on a direct course for Henderson Field. He checked the range, 137 miles. At the standard radar's maximum effective range of 80 miles, these aircraft would have remained invisible for another 20 minutes or more. 20 minutes that would have made the difference between a successful interception and another devastating raid. Daniel grabbed the field telephone and made the call that would validate everything he had worked for. The duty officer was skeptical, almost hostile. The soup can radar, the thing that everyone laughed about. Surely this was a false alarm, a phantom return, another failure of improvised equipment that should never have been trusted. But Daniel was certain. He had spent his life learning to read signals hidden in noise, and these signals were as clear as any he had ever seen. 43 aircraft bearing 315, range 137 miles. Real targets. Real threat. Real opportunity to save lives. The officer made the decision to trust him. The general alarm sounded across Henderson Field, waking pilots from exhausted sleep, sending ground crews running to their aircraft, triggering a scramble that had never before been attempted with so much warning time. 23 American fighters got airborne within 15 minutes, an unprecedented achievement for the beleaguered garrison. They climbed to altitude and flew northwest, guided by Daniel's continued radar tracking, positioning themselves directly in the path of the incoming raid. The interception was devastating, a massacre that reversed the pattern of losses the Americans had suffered for months. The Japanese formation, expecting to catch the Americans unprepared as they had done so many times before, instead flew directly into a buzzsaw of waiting fighters. American pilots, for once holding every advantage of position and altitude and preparation, tore through the enemy formation with methodical precision. The battle lasted less than 20 minutes. When it was over, the skies above Guadalcanal belonged to the Americans. 18 Japanese bombers were shot down, their burning wreckage scattered across the ocean and jungle. 12 more were damaged severely enough that they would never fly again. The remaining 13 jettisoned their bombs into the ocean and fled north, their attack a complete failure. American losses, 2 fighters damaged, no pilots killed, and it had all started with a soup can. The aftermath of the November 11th interception transformed Daniel Kowalski from a joke into a legend. From the crazy sergeant with the soup can to the man who had saved Henderson Field. Officers who had mocked his modification now studied it intently, asking questions about focal lengths and signal concentration and parabolic geometry that Daniel answered with the patience of a teacher who understood that his students had not meant to be cruel, only skeptical. The soup can reflector was photographed from every angle, measured with precision instruments, analyzed by engineers who had never imagined that improvised garbage could outperform their carefully designed equipment. Within weeks, similar modifications were being tested at radar stations throughout the Solomon Islands and beyond. Some worked better than others. The improvised nature of the original made exact replication difficult, but the principle proved sound. Parabolic reflectors made from whatever materials were available could substantially extend radar detection ranges, providing crucial additional warning time for air defense operations. Daniel was promoted to technical sergeant and transferred to a radar development unit based in New Caledonia. His job was now to systematize what he had discovered through trial and error, to transform guerrilla engineering into reproducible technique. It was less exciting than frontline service, but arguably more important. Every radar improvement he helped develop would save lives across the entire Pacific War. He spent the rest of the war in laboratories and workshops, far from the combat he had experienced on Guadalcanal. He tested equipment, trained operators, wrote technical manuals that translated his intuitive understanding into procedures that others could follow. The soup can was replaced by properly manufactured reflectors, the improvisation by systematic engineering, but the underlying insight remained the same. The signal is always there. You just have to help it find its way to you. Daniel returned to Pittsburgh in 1946, decorated but unchanged in the ways that mattered most. He took a job with a radio manufacturing company, Westinghouse, applying his wartime experience to peacetime products, television sets, commercial radio equipment, the emerging technology of consumer electronics. He married a woman named Helen, who had worked at the Westinghouse plant during the war, assembling the same kinds of equipment that Daniel had used in the Pacific. Together they raised 3 children in a small house in the suburbs, a house with a garage workshop where Daniel continued tinkering with radio equipment, just as his father had tinkered before him, passing the knowledge to a new generation. He rarely spoke about the war. When his children asked about his service, he told them only that he had worked with radios in the Pacific, the soup can modification, the 43 aircraft, the interception that had saved hundreds of lives. These stories remained private, shared only with Helen in quiet moments when the memories surfaced unbidden. His father had died in 1944 of a heart attack brought on by decades of labor in the steel mills, while Daniel was still overseas, fighting a war that Stefan had supported with all his heart. Stefan Kowalski never knew that the lessons he had taught in a cramped shed behind a Pittsburgh row house had been applied on a jungle island thousands of miles away. He never knew that his principle of signal reflection, the simple idea of using curved metal to focus radio waves, had helped turn the tide of a battle. He never knew that his son had honored his memory in the most meaningful way possible, by using what he had learned to help others survive. Daniel thought about his father often in the years after the war. He thought about the nights they had spent together hunting for distant stations, about the patience and attention that radio work required, about the reflector that had pulled a Polish voice from across the ocean. He thought about how knowledge passed between generations, how skills learned in one context could transform situations that the teacher never imagined. In 1987, a historian researching early warning radar in the Pacific War tracked Daniel down at his home in the suburbs of Pittsburgh. The historian had found references to the soup can modification in archived technical reports, a few photographs, some handwritten notes, mentions in after-action reports from Guadalcanal, and wanted to interview the man who had invented it. Daniel agreed reluctantly. He was 68 years old now, retired from Westinghouse, his hearing damaged by decades of exposure to radio equipment and industrial noise. The story seemed so long ago, so disconnected from the quiet life he had built since the war, the grandchildren, the garden, the workshop where he still tinkered with electronics when his hands were steady enough. The interview lasted 3 hours. Daniel explained the modification in technical detail, describing the calculations he had made, the experiments he had conducted, the moment when he had first seen 43 aircraft appear on a screen that should not have been able to detect them. He spoke about his father and the shed in Pittsburgh, about the lessons that had made everything possible. At the end, the historian asked the question that everyone eventually asked. How did it feel to know that your soup can had saved so many lives? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, remembering the night of November 11th, 1942, the green glow of the radar screen, the cluster of blips at the edge of detection, the decision to trust what he was seeing. It felt like listening, he said finally. It felt like all those years with my father had been preparation for one moment when I needed to hear what no one else could hear. The signal was there. The Japanese aircraft were there, approaching in the darkness. And because of a piece of scrap metal and some principles my father taught me, I was able to hear them coming. He paused, his eyes distant. That's what radar is, really. It's listening. It's paying attention to signals that most people ignore. My father taught me that the signal is always there, waiting to be found. On that night, I found it. And because I found it, men who would have died went home to their families instead. He died in 1993 at the age of 74, peacefully in his sleep on a winter night when snow was falling on Pittsburgh just as it had fallen on the night he was born. He was buried in a cemetery not far from where his father lay, the two men reunited in death after being separated by war. His children found the original soup can in his workshop after the funeral, the actual can he had cut and shaped on Guadalcanal, preserved for 50 years, the metal now darkened with age but the shape still clearly visible. Daniel had kept it all that time, moving it from house to house, never displaying it, but never throwing it away either. It was a connection to a moment that had defined his life, a reminder of what he had accomplished, with nothing but scrap metal and the lessons of a Polish steelworker. His grandson, a young engineer named Stefan, named for Daniel's father, continuing the chain of knowledge across generations, asked if he could keep the can. He placed it on a shelf in his office at the engineering firm where he worked, where it remained for years, a battered piece of metal that visitors sometimes asked about, prompting Stefan to tell the story of his grandfather, and the night when a soup can had spotted 43 Japanese aircraft before anyone else could see them. They had mocked the soup can radar hack. They had called it ridiculous, desperate, the fantasy of a man who had lost his grip on reality. They had laughed at the idea that garbage from the mess tent could improve military equipment designed by professional engineers, and then they had watched it spot 43 Japanese aircraft before anyone else, giving American pilots the warning they needed to achieve the most successful interception of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. 18 bombers destroyed, hundreds of American lives saved, a turning point in the battle for an island that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. If this story moved you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share in the comments what touched you most, and tell us where you are watching from today. These stories survive when we remember them together, and together, we ensure that the ingenuity of ordinary soldiers who saw what others missed is never forgotten. The men who laughed at Daniel Kowalski were not fools. They were exhausted soldiers fighting for survival on an island that seemed determined to kill them, surrounded by enemies on land and sea and air. They had no patience for experiments, no tolerance for modifications that looked like the desperate improvisations of a man who had cracked under pressure. Their skepticism was earned through hard experience of promises that failed and innovations that killed. But Daniel understood something they did not, something his father had taught him in a shed behind a Pittsburgh row house over years of patient instruction, something about signals hidden in noise and the patience required to find them. He understood that sometimes the answer to a complex problem was not more complexity but less, not sophisticated equipment, but simple principles applied with care and precision. The signal is always there, you just have to help it find its way to you. That is what Daniel Kowalski proved on the night of November 11th, 1942. That is what we should remember today. That is the lesson that passed from a Polish steelworker to his son, and from that son to a grandson, and now from that story to all of us who hear it.